I'm walking down the street.
I do want to say to Donnie and many of you in this room that over a very long career in this city, all of you have helped me and my colleagues tell the truth and to try to tell.
I may not look like you and you me, but
my head up.
I'm from South Carolina, so I just...
What does this event mean to you, Miss Peggy Moss?
Oh, my heart.
Happy 20th anniversary.
My heart is about loving up on my sisters. Do you know what it feels like to have your sisters in the room? Donnie.
And that'll be different and unique. I'm gonna be the best me I can be by letting His glory shine through. I am beautiful, I am blessed, but not just what you see in the flesh. I'm free from people, free from myself. There's
The doctor lived next door to the janitor, to the reverend, and the lawyer. We were together. Now we get so high and mighty that you create stress for your society because you don't like poor black folks either. That's a health problem. Get yourself together so I can stop being taking care of geriatric people and get back to pediatrics. I thank you, Donnie, for all you've done. Let's keep doing it all the more.
letting His glory shine through. That'll be you, that'll be me, that'll be different and unique. I'm gonna be the best me I can be by letting His glory shine through. And I dare you, I dare you, I dare you to be you.
First name's Donnie, last name's Glover. In it to win it for the long haul, baby. Now listen, we have a now every show is special. Don't get me wrong. Every single show is special. But this one is particularly special because we have the professor with us today. Now, I'm typically the professor on this show, but I had to go get my professor. Well, he wasn't literally my professor, but enough to be everybody's professor, Professor Larry Gibson from the University of Maryland Law School. I saw him recently at an event where they were celebrating Esther McCready and Shirley Nathan Pulliam down at the University of Maryland School of Nursing. And I learned some things on that day that just blew my mind, not only about Esther McCready, not only about Shirley Nathan Pulliam, but also about Professor Gibson. He's a political guru. He's been involved in the major Black political campaigns of this city and of this state. Now, not every campaign, but some of the key ones, some of the more important ones. One being the election of Kurt Schmoke. Now, he's going to share some history on that. But another election that he was a part of that we should all know was the election of Maryland's first Black governor, Wes Moore. Now, without further ado, I present to you now Black History, by the way, is every day. Now, we wanted to get him technically in the month, but he's a busy man. And so we're glad to get him in this day. And let me just say, March is Women's History Month. And we're going to be talking about some powerful women in our community. And again, without further ado, Professor Larry Gibson. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes.
The pleasure's all ours. How are you today?
I am doing fine. Let me turn this light on and look a little better. I think if I get a little glow here on the situation, I don't know. Is that any better?
Yes.
I'm doing fine. I survived the Black History Month. You know, this is the first time where I got it down to under 10 speeches and presentations. I really, because the average month, February for me, is about 18 or so speaking engagements. This time, I think it's I had 6. So I've worked on it because I begged off. I told everybody last year I was all busy with Westmore's campaign. I got to get back to my book, and I actually learned to say no, but I just couldn't say no to you. But I did push you out. I did push you out of Black History Month, didn't I?
It's okay. And since we are in Women's History Month, how is your wife?
Diana is fine. She is just. We will in July celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary in July, and just recently we discovered something. I remember when we met because I have a photograph of the day we met, and but she pulled out some materials on notes taken on that day. It turns out that we met exactly to the day 2 years before we got married. We got married on July the 7th, 1973, and we met July the 7th, 1971. And she had notes of it because we met when I came to her class at Towson. She was a teacher, but was taking a graduate course. And I was on the school board then, and had put something through called a magnet school plan. And her professor invited me to speak. And so there was this attractive lady who I walked to her car, and she had a friend and took a picture. So we have a photograph of the day we met.
Wow.
Have that. That's in 19.
We don't get to hear the romantic side of Professor Gibson too often. It all happened on Towson's campus.
Towson's campus. Whenever I go by there, I just smile because, it was a smaller place. It was called Towson State Teachers College. It was only a couple of buildings. There was a main classroom building and then another little smaller building that had administrative stuff. But now it's a big university. But it was Towson State Teachers College, and I have just fond thoughts of that place whenever I go by.
We always see the football player side of you. That's what I think of politics. Politics is a full contact sport, but lo and behold, we get to see the soft underbelly of the football player.
Yeah.
His romantic side. Speaking of powerful women, and again, kudos to you and your wife. Happy anniversary on just any time together in this day and time, but 50 years. What a glorious accomplishment. What a glorious thing for two people. Esther McCready. Let's just get straight to the jugular.
Oh, yes.
Who was Esther McCready?
Esther McCready was the first Black student to attend University of Maryland nursing school. But people underestimate the significance of that. It was not just that she desegregated that nursing school. She destroyed what had been called the Southern Compact. This was a contractual arrangement entered into by the governors of 9 southern states. What they had to do was to provide graduate education for their Black students, Marylanders, or their state people, to the extent there were graduate programs for white students. But rather than provide them within the state, each individual state, they entered into agreement that they would accept each other's respective Black students. And they called it the Regional Compact. And the regional school for nursing was at Meharry Medical College, where also the regional school for Black doctors was. So if you were Marylander, because Maryland provided nursing at the University of Maryland for white students, they would pay for you to go to Tennessee. And her lawsuit was the first successful litigation in which a court said, no, your obligation to provide equal treatment under the law must be honored inside the borders of your state. Now, that was a Maryland court decision, but that exact reasoning was then later adopted by a federal court. So what Resta McCready did was open up professional state schools to African Americans all over the United States. So she celebrated for this desegregation of the University of Maryland Medical School, but she really should be celebrated for beginning the process of providing professional schools throughout the South to African Americans in their own states, nursing schools, pharmacy schools, and the like. Now, the University of Maryland Law School case involving Thurgood Marshall as counsel and Donald Murray had established that for law schools, but they had applied that only to law schools. The thinking was that the law was varied from one state to the other, so you needed to go to your state law school. But the argument was that as to nursing and to medicine, they didn't change from one state to the other. And so long as there was some access somewhere in the country and the state would pay at least the transportation for you to get there, that was okay until Esther McCready won her case.
Professor, do you feel as though this country has spent an inordinate amount of time over race?
Well, this country started with a notion, one phase of this country. Remember, this piece of land had been here for hundreds of years, occupied by people of color. Then, once Europeans arrived here, they began to take advantage of, suppress, and everybody else, starting with the Native Americans, and then the Spanish, Latin sort of south of the United States, folks who had come here up through Mexico, and then blacks. So throughout the history of a couple hundred, about 250 years of this country, this was a place where white supremacy dominated to the detriment of all other races. And so that's a part of American history.
Did it ever make you bitter?
Well, I understood. I certainly didn't like what was happening, as was the case for all of us. I don't know if bitter is the word. It certainly made me determined to do what I could to help set things right. But I don't know if I would call it a bitterness. It was more of being aware of what was going on and trying to find some role that I could play in offsetting it, and in later years playing some role in making sure we recognize others who had made contributions, and also just preserving our history. I've become, over the last 30, I guess so, years, of a historian, in the sense that I write and talk a lot about this history.
How did you get into law?
Well, I was at Howard University, and while I was at Howard University, I came to see how central the law was. That we were enslaved by the law. The law led to our, at least the end of slavery, but then we were segregated by the law. And it became very clear to me that every phase of our development, the law was central to it. And so I decided that, well, if that's the case, let me get involved with that. So I went from Howard University to Columbia University School of Law. I practiced a few more years, but then we decided that we need many more lawyers. And that's when I went starting in 1972 through legal education. There were black lawyers, but I figured that as a law professor, I could multiply the number of black lawyers, and said I've been a law professor ever since then. Although I've continued to practice, my principal life goal was to produce many more lawyers, and I've been at Maryland for 48 years, but I've also visited at the University of Mississippi. I taught there in 1975 at Ole Miss, University of Virginia, North Carolina Central, and I also taught as a visiting professor in Scotland and Great Britain.
Okay, Professor, I just, we're paying homage to you, and I'll get on to these famous black lawyers, but Columbia University, that is no slouch of a school.
Oh, no, yeah, no, it's a tough school. I was there from 64 to 67, and this was an experience that was extremely valuable. And also, I attribute Columbia University to my becoming a law professor, because the way I became a law professor is that in around 1971, a former professor of mine at Columbia, Monrad Paulson, became the dean at University of Virginia Law School. There had never been a Northerner, anybody other than a Southerner, as the dean of University of Virginia. One day I get a call from him. He says, Larry, I've been appointed to dean. He hadn't yet been sworn in at Virginia. I'm going to be traveling by train from New York to Washington, and I'd like to get off the train in Baltimore. If you could meet me at the station, there's something I want to talk with you about. And I was a busy lawyer, but sure, I'm going to talk to a former law professor of mine. And it's at the Penn Station here in Baltimore. He said, have you ever thought about teaching? There's never been a black in any law school in the South, other than historically a black university, Virginia or any other place. Are you willing to be the first one? That was the beginning of my law teaching, and I taught at Virginia until 1974, first 1 year part-time and then 2 years as a full-time professor. Got married, and that beautiful wife of mine, whom you mentioned earlier, just did not like Charlottesville.
I bet she did. I didn't like it either.
She says, I've been tired of being had over. We'll have to have you over. Oh boy, that went on. That was dinner. And so we came back to the University of Maryland, and it was my mission for this law school to do a big part of overcoming the underrepresentation of blacks in the law profession. And I'm very proud of the fact that within 10 years of my joining the faculty there, we, for a period of time, led the nation in the percentage of blacks in its student body, other than a historically a black college. I mean, through the 80s, we were top in the country, and we had as our stated objective, the law school, not just mine, but the whole faculty, the white and black faculty, for our law school to represent, to have the percentage that was in blacks in Maryland, around 24%. So yeah, we produced a lot of lawyers.
Okay, one last personal question. When did you know that was where you were supposed to be?
Well, that's an interesting question. The dean presented this idea to me, Monrad Paulson, and I had to decide whether to do it. I was also doing a lot of important work as civil rights work. I'd represented the Black Panthers and Soul School and CORE, and so I thought this was important work as a functioning lawyer. But I had a good friend of mine who I had talked to a lot. We'd been on the school board together. He says, Larry, to decide whether you want to switch this, you've got to decide what do you want to be? And I said, what do you mean by that? He says, you've got to reduce to one sentence. What do you want to be in life? And of course, I came with this list of a laundry list. I want to do this. I want to do this. No. He says, you've got to reduce it to one sentence. And I ultimately came up with what to this day is my guiding principle. I decided that I wanted to be a just and learned man. And then I said, well, what would create the best option to do this, teaching or law practice? And I concluded that teaching, because one, to be a just and learned person, I concluded, for example, I needed to read more. I was reading, but busy, not having enough. And also, I concluded that I had to see the world. You can't be a just and learned person, at least I couldn't, until I'd seen the world. And teaching allowed me time to do both of those, particularly the travel, because the school semesters are such that you have freedom in the summer. And then I married a beautiful lady who liked those two objectives. And for 20 years, we essentially worked teaching during the school year and traveling in the summer. And I've been to about 75 countries. But my life goal got slightly adjusted. In the middle of that, I would be periodically running political campaigns. Starting in 1968, I ran the first my campaign with Joe Howard was elected judge, and it was the first time a black was elected citywide. And then
He was
1970,
from he was from Iowa.
yes, he was from Iowa. Yeah. But so I said, wait a minute, this is not. How does this fit within being a just and learned man? So I concluded that I had to amend my life goal. I had to, the first part was the answer of what do I want to be? But then there was the next question is what do I want to do? And I then added a piece to it. And it's guided me to this day. I want to be a just and learned man. And I want to help other just and learned people succeed. To this day, that is what guides my decisions. And so that's a long answer to your question.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, here in the city of Baltimore, there's a street that cuts straight through, goes from Upton straight on through Bolton Hill called McMecken Street. Along Druid Hill Avenue, there's a mural, and one of the pictures of the 6 people is Harry Scythe Cummings. And I'm a couple of days younger than you, but I've come to learn that this area, this Druid Hill Avenue, McCullough Street corridor, and I thought it was weird until you explained to me that there used to be 2-way streets, but these 1-way streets, one going north, one going south, had the different churches. And you mentioned the Black Panthers, the Goon Squad also comes to mind. But, Irvin Reed and Darius George Hall said hello to you. But so much happened in that area. Can you take me back to there, to Druid Hill?
Absolutely. You're speaking of what we call now Upton, but the principal through streets are McCullough, Druid Hill, Division, and then immediately to the west of that, Pennsylvania Avenue. This was the center of Black West Baltimore, and it is the place where Black businesses, professionals lived. And what you are referring to as to the beginning of the destruction of that was the making of Druid Hill and McCullough Street one way. The city was growing to the northwest. What they called the suburbs, Forest Park Avenue and Park Heights and all were developing. And these were white neighborhoods, and these folks wanted to be able to get downtown quickly. And the solution to it was to convert McCullough and Druid Hill Avenue McCullough Street, Drew Avenue, which were the main streets of this black business district, into one way. The earliest environmental justice litigation that I can find was a suit brought by Charles Houston to try to prevent that. He actually sued to try to stop the conversion of those streets into one-way streets. And now suits dealing with environmental matters are commonplace, but I can't find any earlier environmental justice litigation. He lost that lawsuit, but yes, that was the center of the black community, business, professional. Now there was another, not as large, East Baltimore, a part of it centered around Dunbar High School, and a little to the east of Dunbar. But that was a thriving a neighborhood, and as you go through it now, you can see some remnants. I mean, of that. Of course, you've mentioned the largest being the churches. I mean, the Union Baptist Church, and well, there's several churches there, but there are also the major large halls were there. The Prince Hall Masons, the Elks was a large that blacks were involved with there, and so the institutions were there.
There was a mayor. He is known as the father of segregation. He reigned over Baltimore from 1907 to 1911. His name was J. Barry Mahou. When I read about this so-called father of American apartheid, I felt an eerie feeling. I felt an eerie feeling like, ooh, the boogeyman. But then I learned of Ashby Hawkins. I learned of George McMecken. Who were these black lawyers, Professor?
Well, Baltimore developed a strong group of black lawyers. So the first, I mean, for a long time, to become a lawyer, by law, you had to be a statute, actually, in the law. The first lawsuit didn't succeed, but a second one did in 1885. That suit was brought by and paid for by the pastor of Union Baptist Church, Harvey Johnson. So we got in 1885 the first black attorney. We didn't have it in Baltimore, so they went over to Washington, D.C. and recruited Everett Waring. And then there developed over about the next 20 years a strong cadre of black lawyers, and you've mentioned W. Ashby Hawkins. Now, W. Ashby Hawkins was really our first great civil rights lawyer. He had actually attended the University of Maryland Law School for 1 year until they expelled the two blacks. They had already, after that first lawsuit, two African Americans had attended and graduated in 1887 from the University of Maryland Law School, Harry Scythe Cummings and a man named Johnson. They then let two more blacks in, and they were there for 1 year. The students and students got in such an uproar, they expelled them. And both W. Ashby Hawkins and a man named John Dozier finished at Howard University. Hawkins was an amazing guy. He'd been an educator for many years before he became a lawyer. But then he became a leading black attorney, dealing with so many different matters, opposing the housing developments as it relates to segregated housing that you just mentioned. Because what happened was, there was always discrimination in housing, but it was not illegal for black to move into a white neighborhood until what you are referring to occurred, which they passed laws making it a crime for a black to move into a house that was in a predominantly white neighborhood. Of course, it flipped it the other way also. It said also a white couldn't move um, into a black block. That all grew out of George McMecken and W. Ashby Hawkins deciding that they were going to desegregate McCullough Street. I mentioned McCullough and Druid Hill as being the center of that community, that black community. Well, the boundary for many years had been Druid Hill. Blacks weren't on McCullough. And so George McMecken moved into a house about the 1800 block of Druid of McCullough Street. There was such an uproar that the city council passed laws making it a crime for a black to move into a predominantly white neighborhood. And the interesting thing, this is the first time this was done, such a law existed in the United States. They went and copied that law in many other parts of the country. In fact, they called it the Baltimore law. So there had been discrimination, but it was not the criminal law. This was the criminal stuff. And then the creativity of Hawkins. Hawkins actually knocked down two versions of the laws, and the city council would come and correct the defects. The most fascinating case that I find I just delighted about, there was a part of Pressman Street that it was on a corner. The legal interest was in off of Pressman. No, not Pressman. It was Baker Street. I'm sorry about this little phone here.
Okay.
You okay? The legal interest was on Baker Street, which was a white block, but it was a corner house that had an entrance in off of Mount Street, which was a black block. So to show the absurdity of this, Hawkins arranged really to have a black move in there and sue. No. They moved in. He was then prosecuted. Man's name was Jackson. He was then prosecuted for moving into a house in which the longest part of the building was on the McCullough Street. The legal entrance was on Baker Street, and you know what they did? They then renumbered the owner of the place, and the black guy took another number. The next number coming down Mount Street. They were prosecuted for illegal changing the number of a house and for occupying this thing. What led to but ultimately the Supreme Court declared such statutes unconstitutional, and Hawkins had knocked out two versions in Maryland, and he was so disappointed that the case that went up to the Supreme Court was not the Maryland case. It was the Louisville, Kentucky case. It was a statute patterned exactly after the Maryland law, but the first case to get up to the Supreme Court was that Louisville, Kentucky. He submitted an amicus curiae brief, but he was trying to get this Maryland case up, but the Kentucky case got there first.
Professor, you threw in a Latin term that us lay people that's straight over our head. What's the term?
Oh, amicus curiae. He's not a part of the case. Amicus curiae means friend of the court. In appellate court, Supreme Court, and other appellate courts, it's fairly common to have people who are not formally a part of litigation file briefs that the court will consider, and they're called friends of the court. So he submitted in that Louisville, Kentucky case an amicus curiae, in a case that he had hoped to set up to come from Maryland. But he did so many great things. Another thing that W. Ashby Hawkins did was the attempt to desegregate Maryland Institute. Maryland Institute was and still is a private institution, but they got a lot of money from the city. In fact, there was an arrangement with the city in which each member of the city council could appoint one person to go to Maryland Institute. Well, the first black councilman, Harry Sides Cummings, actually had a person appointed, and they went and they succeeded. But the next time, the next councilman, black councilman, his person was rejected, and Hawkins brought a lawsuit. The institution's response was, "This is a private entity." Remember that the main thing that they were relying upon was the Equal Protection Clause, which says that the state shall not deprive a person of equal protection. And they said, "No, this is not the state. This is a private institution." He did not win that case, but later that institution ultimately desegregates. But Hawkins was a part of the Niagara movement that ultimately produced the NAACP. He was quite a guy, and his law partner, his brother-in-law, because they were married to sisters, was George W.F. McMechen. McMechen is the first graduate of Morgan after Morgan becomes a 4-year institution. It's originally was Centenary Bible Institute. It was run by the church, and its primary mission was teaching folks for the ministry. But it later then added a teacher education program to it, and then they ultimately changed the name to Morgan College. And the first graduate is George W. F. McMechen. He was from West Virginia. He had come to Maryland. He graduated from Yale Law School and practiced for about 40 years here in Baltimore. He was into mainly domestic relations, real estate, and fraternal organizations. He was a national head of the Elks, and also very active in the Masons, and so they were law partners.
Professor, when I learned about how those two went against J. Barry Mahul, the mayor, and the whole institution or the onset of legalized apartheid, I was restored with faith and hope that as long as there have been racial challenges, I am reminded that there have always been Black people who stood up against it.
Also, Baltimoreans. I mean, over my shoulder here, of course, is the person I've spent my time making sure people remember Thurgood Marshall. This city has produced so many important leaders in various aspects of civil rights, but particularly the law. I mean, Clarence Mitchell, of course, is the person that for the '64 Civil Rights Act, I consider him the architect. I remember as a student at Howard University meeting him for the first time, even though he was from Baltimore. I met him when I was a student body president at Howard University, as he just plowed the corridors of Congress, shaping the specific details of what became the 1964 Civil Rights Act, because we'd gotten a lot of what we could do by the courts, but there was a limit. There was a point at which the court said, no, you can't stretch this this concept of state. Remember the 14th Amendment: the state shall not deprive. There's some things that are private. For example, privately owned restaurants and hotels and other places of public accommodation. So that's why the '64 Civil Rights Act was necessary. They did reach a point where the courts said, no, this is not the state. This is not government. In order to eliminate racial discrimination here, you're going to either need another constitutional amendment, or you're going to need legislation. And ultimately, that legislation was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I was the head of something called the DC Students for Civil Rights. It was a group of students from 8 colleges and universities in the Washington area. And we primarily lobbied Congress for against the filibuster that the Southerners were undertaking. And I'll never forget meeting Clarence Mitchell. We had a meeting, and he came to it. And he says, each of you, he went around the room. He asked each student, where are you from? These are students at Gallaudet, at American University, at Howard University, Georgetown, the various Washington area colleges. And many were from the deep South. He says, hey, what I want is for you, each of you, to go to see your senator. Now, the students from Alabama and Mississippi says, what do you mean? I'm not going to, Eastland and Stennis and Strom Thurmond, they're not going to support this. Mr. Mitchell says, those are your senators. He says, not my senators. He insisted that the students go to the office in the capital of whatever the senator of whatever state they were from. And he was absolutely he said, well, that had not been our initial game plan. That's not what we were doing. Initially, I guess we were going to face fence sitters and folks who at least we thought had a reasonable chance of supporting civil rights. And Mr. Mitchell was insistent, oh, you do that too, but you go to see your senator. And I'm sure for most of these young folks from the South, my roommate was from Mississippi. He was from, no, not from Mississippi, he was from Birmingham, he was from Alabama. He says, no, I'm going to go to see my senators. I'm from, yes, he says, I said, that's what the man said to do. Now, I don't know. He probably did go. I never asked Billy whether he actually went to see his senators. But my point is that was the kind of leadership that Maryland has provided to this movement. I mean, just think. Harriet Tubman is a Marylander. Frederick Douglass is a Marylander. Henry Allen Garnett is a Marylander. Charles Houston was from Washington, D.C., but he certainly came over here an awful lot. Of course, Thurgood Marshall and Lily Mae Jackson. So we can be proud of the contributions, at least as it relates to the law, that Marylanders have made.
Wow, I'm blown away at this history. And I've come to revere the role of the Black lawyer. We talked about Charles Hamilton Houston. He was the dean of the law school that Thurgood Marshall attended, Howard University Law. And
produced an awful lot of civil rights lawyers. Let's just go one state down. Oliver Hill, classmate of Thurgood Marshall. Becomes the leading civil rights lawyer in Virginia, and there you can repeat that throughout the South. I mean, the contribution of the lawyers tutored by Charles Hamilton Houston reaches throughout the South.
Are enough Blacks from Baltimore involved in law today?
Well, we never have enough because the job is not done. But there are. I'm real encouraged by this by these young folks, and in the leadership positions they are taking. I mean, we had our Black law students banquet last week, and to see the roles that they are taking. I mean, the county executive of Prince George's County, the county attorney of Baltimore County, James Benjamin. Well, I won't start naming names. There are many of them, and many of them I'm very, very proud of.
Why do lawyers make better politicians?
Well, what is the role of elected officials? Principally, making and enforcing the laws. They're the legislative branch, which is principally passing laws. So people who are trained in the law. We go to the judicial branch, which you generally have to be a lawyer, and then the executive branch is helpful if you have training and what a big part of what you're going to do is involved. That's not the only thing. I mean, people in the executive branch have to spend money, but even that's controlled a lot by law. Government is the management of laws, and people who are trained in the law naturally are going to have some special abilities there.
Now, I don't want to gloss over it, but tell me about the significance of Joe Howard.
This is 1968. Up until 1968, Black politics in Maryland, and certainly in Baltimore, was, in terms of effective electing people, was isolated really to one part of Baltimore. We generally called it the 4th District. That was the councilmatic district. But there had been people elected to the legislature. Harry Cole had been elected for a while to the Senate, and we had some city council people. But we did not have a sense that we had a citywide political power. And what happened in 68 was the first time Blacks elected someone on a citywide basis. And to some extent, it was our reaction to the assassination of King. Everyone who was around had some sort of strong reaction to the assassination of King. I mean, there are people who left the country. There are people who founded other organizations. Some people demonstrated their frustration and autistic. And some of us said, look, let's get more control of these instruments of government. That was well, I had two reactions to King's assassination. That changed my profession, at least as to where I was going to start practicing. I was a law clerk for a federal judge when King was assassinated, with the intention of going to what was then called Vettel H. and Howell. I would have been the first Black in one of the white law firms. But when King was killed, I said, nope, I'm not going to work for the man. What's
Did
the
you have a
largest black law
dashiki
firm in
on?
the city?
Were you wearing a dashiki in a bush?
I dashiki in the bush. I said, I'm not going to go work. I literally asked, what is the largest black law firm? And I went to Brown, Allen, Watts, Murphy, and Russell. So that was, I mean, it had an impact in a lot of different ways. And then that very year, as I ended my clerkship in 1968, a group of young folks, Billy Murphy, myself, David Allen, Maria Broom, many of these people,
Maria Broom?
Oh, very much so. She was a major leader of this. Her best friend was Marcia Conti, and decided to try to elect somebody. We went to two things. We tried to two positions. Actually, there were three. It was called Mitchell Howard Williams. It was Joe Howard was the judge. Perrin Mitchell was not citywide, but it was back then the 7th Congressional District was all inside Baltimore, and a people's judgeship, Archie Williams. We came close with Perrin that year. That was 68. Perrin wins the next year. I'll get to the next year, but we won with Joe. So Joe was the first time that African Americans on a citywide basis exercised political strength and elected someone that they chose. Then 2 years later, using from that, we had a really good year. We elected Milton Allen as the state's attorney, first Black prosecutor. I was his campaign manager. Billy Murphy's father Alan Murphy Chester, and Parra Mitchell was sent to Congress. So, but what launched at 70 really was the 68 the 68 election, and so that's how that process began.
What was the most exciting campaign of all?
Whoa, I don't know. Let me see. The ones that come to mind to me are Joe Howard's, the 70 Parra Mitchell, and the election of Kurt Smoke as the first elected black mayor. But there are others that were exciting, but those come to mind. Yeah, yeah. The election of Kurt Smoke as mayor was a big one too.
This is a bit of a curveball, but I think you can handle it. We recently lost an icon. His name was Malik Rahman. And I would like to get some blessings from heaven. Do you remember Malik Rahman?
I remember my right hand throughout the Kurt Smoke years. I mean, do I remember Malik Rahman? Yes. Malik Rahman, I'm trying to remember how that happened, but anyway, he just kind of showed up. He had some earlier difficulty, but man, he throughout all of the Kurt Smoke years was my running buddy. You know, you had a sidekick. Well, that was mine. He was a fantastic guy. And back then, you did a lot of door-to-door campaigning. And Malik was a handsome guy. And you remember the way we did signs then? We went in the houses and we taped them up in the windows. And there was many a house, and we'd have a whole crew coming down, and they would say, he can come in and put the sign up. He can come in and put anything he wants up. Malik Rahman, he was a fantastic guy. And I miss him. He passed about a month ago. So
Westmore, we might as well land on where we are today. We have about 7 minutes, and thank you so much for your time. I hope that we have enlightened people about the significance of the black lawyer coming out of Baltimore, including the first black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, who lives 3 blocks from here. But Westmore, Governor Westmore, you were there from the beginning to the end, from the rooter to the tutor. You must be proud.
I am. I admit that I'm still beaming. I think back through that election, people saw those signs and leave no one behind. All 25,000 of those were organized in my backyard, right, right here. Yes, he's a exceptionally bright, decent. There's something special about him. I can't quite figure it out, but that this is an unusual guy. And Kurt Smoke was the one who kept telling me about him. Because I'm finishing up this next book, and I really didn't want to be bothered. I've been there, one election after another. It was, and I had told my literary agent and my publisher, no, I'm not going to, in 21, I'm not going to let anything else get in the way. But then I kept talking to Wes, and he was running his campaign. And it was clear to me that he could win, but he wasn't exactly heading towards winning. I was concerned. And then I said, okay, let me go and get involved with this. And I'm glad I did. He's an exceptional person, and I'm quite optimistic about what he's going to do.
A tad Obama-ish, and I say that because there are many who jump into a race, but you and I know that he didn't just jump into this race.
No.
Like Obama, he had been looking at some type of office more than a decade ago.
Yep. He had made a decision, some part of his life, of what he called dedicated to public service. And yet he had kind of made that decision. And in my early discussions, I wished him well, but I told him I got to finish this book. I got these other things to do.
You gave him the shoulder. You gave him the cold shoulder.
I can't let this man lose. The same thing would happen with Kurt. I tried, but Kurt was early in his career. He was out. He had been a Rhodes Scholar. He was in a good law firm. I had some travel plans. So I first tried to talk people out of running. I couldn't talk him out. I said, okay, well, I got to see that he wins. It was almost the same thing with Wes. Look, man, I've been down here before. I mean, the first gubernatorial campaign I was involved with was Parron Mitchell, was the lieutenant governor candidate with Steve Sachs. That's 1986. I was the co-chair of that campaign. So that was a long time ago. But after a while, I said, "Nah, I can't let his brother lose."
Professor Gibson, I want to take my hat off to you. You are the guru. You have set the bar very high, and many of us look up to you and appreciate you. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, my final thought is about you. You have been consistent and just intrepid in your determination to use your skill and your energy to educate our folks. I've watched it for years. No, now it's into decades. You are a gem that folks don't fully appreciate. And so I want to thank you. Thank you for years of being Donnie Glover. You kind of like said, I'm going to do this a little bit different. And you created your whole network here. It was not like something you moved in and stepped in. And folks didn't even understand what you were doing. I remember the early on periods of your development of your online presence and all, and I didn't understand it. You sort of saw it. You sort of were ahead of the game in it, and you've just been consistent. And thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gibson. You've touched a lot of people. Craig Thompson looks up to you. A lot of people who, and Maria Broom. I would have never known about Maria Broom.
I can show you photographs of Maria Broom in 1968 in our campaign office.
We didn't even touch your avid photography.
Oh, I've done that. That's been my life. I've been a photographer longer than I've been anything else, and I'm glad I've just thousands of that. But soon they're now developing. We're developing a website. A lot of this is going to be in a website that will. It's months before it goes live, in which there will be literally hundreds of historical photos of going back, certainly at least to 1968. And you'll see photographs of Maria Broom.
Professor, I want to thank you. And again, I want to thank your wife for sharing you with us. We know that we have taken you away, and you've taught me some things, 50 years of matrimony and traveling the world, being a professor, and but somehow, you've taught us all how to keep family first.
Well, I looked up the very first time. I know I'm difficult to live with. This woman is just an angel. I ended up. You know what my early part was? My wife was beautiful, but she didn't know it, and I would tell her. She didn't know how pretty she was. She honestly did not know. And I would be insecure. I mean, what happens? And she goes to realize.
Well, late Rockmine show up.
So I said, don't.
But you know what I just got? That what God has for you is for you, because God had a special mission for you, and a king needs a queen.
No, he gave me a special one. He gave me the special one. So
Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for sharing with us.
Okay, brother. Okay. Take it easy.
Good morning, world.